She was ready to give everything to save the friend who once saved her, until the surgery revealed a deadly risk no one had foreseen. Her fiancé, a surgeon, secretly intervened to stop the operation, claiming it was love, but it felt like betrayal. And just when it seemed the decision had been taken from her hands, Ji-won made one final move that stunned everyone. But only listen to how this story turns and why, in the end, love paid its price and justice found its voice.
In a tucked-away alley near Hongdae's quieter edge, under a canopy of chipped plastic and neon halos, Yoon Ji-won and Min-jun ran a late-night gimbap stall that only opened after 9 p.m. To passers-by, it was just another food cart. But to students cramming for exams, delivery bikers on midnight breaks, and lonely souls walking their exhaustion through the city, Min-ji Gimbap was something more, a place where warmth arrived rolled in rice and wrapped in seaweed. Every night followed the same rhythm. Ji-won handled the prep and books. Min-jun took orders and told terrible jokes that somehow always landed. Their hands worked like gears, one reaching while the other rolled, dipping, wrapping, slicing. 2 spoons, 1 pot. They shared umbrellas, arguments, even the same chipped thermos when it got too cold. It was a bond built not on romance, but on something more stubborn, survival, and chosen family. They'd grown up in the same state-run group home in Gwangju, where winters bit through donated coats and birthdays came with government-issued snack boxes. Back then, they were just 2 kids who knew better than to dream too far. When they aged out at 18, they made a quiet pact: never let the other starve, emotionally or otherwise. That pact held until the night Min-jun collapsed. It happened mid-shift, while laughing at his own punchline. One moment he was leaning over the cart, joking about adding pineapple to tuna rolls just to cause a scandal. The next, his knees buckled like someone cut the strings. Ji-won caught him, grease still on her gloves. His skin had a yellow tint that wasn't from the streetlights. The emergency room at Severance Hospital smelled like antiseptic and the end of control. Monitors beeped, clipboards shuffled. A hepatologist in a Navy scrub cap appeared, flanked by silence. "Acute liver failure," he said, folding his hands. "He doesn't have much time. A transplant is the most viable option. A living donor would be fastest." They didn't need to ask what that meant. Ji-won volunteered before anyone else could suggest it. The compatibility tests were done in a blur. Min-jun's blood type, hers, tissue markers, cross-match. By the time the results came back, she was a match. Song-jin had already started researching clinical outcomes. Ji-won's fiancé wasn't just a concerned partner. He was also an orthopedic resident at the same hospital, someone who understood exactly what was at stake. When the transplant coordinator gently explained the risks to Ji-won, Song-jin stepped in with colder precision. "There are other options," he said, arms folded. "Deceased donors, regional registries, expanded criteria programs in Daegu and Busan. You're not the only path forward." But time wasn't in the mood for alternatives. Every hour added another symptom to Min-jun's chart: jaundice, confusion, ascites. The old mischief in his eyes dimmed under fluorescent lights. Words started taking longer to form. Ji-won sat through the surgeon's explanation like a student at her final exam. Segments of the liver, the bile duct, the estimated recovery window, the 0.5% chance of mortality, the long-term complications. She heard the words but listened with memory. How Min-jun once pawned his only guitar so she could pay her university deposit when her scholarship fell through. How he spent his entire paycheck buying medicine for her during a brutal winter flu in the orphanage. How he gave her the only new coat he'd ever owned, saying it didn't fit his style. Her body carried his sacrifices in small invisible places: warmth in her ribs during January, strength in her legs during finals, certainty when the world didn't offer any. Now it was her turn. She signed the initial consent form that night. Her hand didn't shake. Not once. Song-jin sat across from her in the hospital cafe, lips pressed into a thin line. He didn't raise his voice, that wasn't his way. But the words were tight, measured, like bolts being screwed into steel. "You don't owe him your liver, Ji-won." She looked up, the fluorescent lights catching the steel in her gaze. "Maybe not," she said, "but I owe him my life, and he never asked me to give it." They didn't speak much after that. She moved into the hospital's patient dorm 2 nights later to start the full workup: MRIs, blood panels, psychological screening. Nurses complimented her calmness. Ji-won kept smiling. It wasn't fake, it was focus. At night, she sat beside Min-jun's bed while he drifted in and out, feeding him broth spoon by spoon. Sometimes he joked that she was trying to poison him slowly. Sometimes he'd cry when he thought she wasn't looking. Neither of them talked about the surgery. But one night, half asleep, he murmured, "You always paid first, even when we were kids." Ji-won brushed his hair back with fingers that remembered the same childhood. "Then let this be the last bill I cover." In the distance, across the corridor, Song-jin watched through the observation glass. He knew surgeries, he'd assisted in over 100, but there was no textbook for this. Not for a woman who'd already decided what love was worth. Not for a man who couldn't bear the cost. Not for a future quietly being rewritten, organ by organ. Shadows lengthened outside as Seoul prepared for sleep. Inside that hospital room, Ji-won stayed seated beside Min-jun's chart, waiting, not for permission, but for the call that would tell her the surgical date was set.
After the consent form was signed, time rearranged itself around the hope that something might intervene before the scalpel did. The hospital social worker, a middle-aged woman with tired kindness in her voice, did more than her job description allowed. She didn't just place Min-jun's name on the national transplant list. She searched for loopholes in outdated databases, called clinics in Jeju and Mokpo, and even reached out to one small, underfunded rural center that hadn't registered a transplant in 3 years. "I'm adding you to every list that exists," she told Ji-won, "and a few that might as well be rumors." Meanwhile, back at the Gimbap cart, Ha-eun, their 21-year-old part-timer with dyed pink hair and more determination than business sense, transformed the humble stall into a digital beacon. She renamed their Instagram handle to @midnightformin-jun and posted a video of herself sobbing through her shift, explaining how the appa who taught me how to fold a proper triangle roll might not make it to winter. Within days, videos began flooding in, shaky footage of regulars describing the warmth of a meal at 2 a.m., of couples who met over tuna mayo rolls, of students who said the free soup during exam week felt like family. The hashtag #SaveKangMin-jun began trending locally. One food vlogger even offered to donate ad revenue if his followers reposted the story. In the hepatology wing, rumors began to float on the sterile air. A fellow from Busan, quietly sympathetic to their case, leaned in one night during rounds and whispered, "There might be a marginal graft coming up. Not ideal, but it's hope." The phrase itself sounded like medicine. Not perfect, but hope. It was all Ji-won needed to stay upright. While she sat in waiting rooms wearing hospital wristbands like jewelry, Song-jin stayed in motion. He made calls between surgeries, dodging senior staff while forwarding articles and medical PDFs to Ji-won at odd hours. He contacted every surgeon he knew, even a professor from Daegu who still owed him a favor for writing a last-minute recommendation letter years ago. He tried to outrun his fear with logistics. But love doesn't live on logistics alone. One afternoon, after scrubbing out of a 6-hour operation, he walked into a quiet shop near Yeouido and bought 2 simple wedding bands. No diamonds, just a promise. He found Ji-won alone in the hospital's rooftop garden, sipping barley tea from a vending machine and watching the hazy skyline. Without preamble, he pressed the ring into her palm. "Let's set a date," he said gently. "Let's give ourselves something that isn't a hospital room." Ji-won didn't answer immediately, but her fingers closed around the ring like she was afraid it might float away. For the first time in weeks, she didn't feel like someone simply waiting for bad news. And for a moment, the world bent in their favor. The fellow's whispered rumor turned into a real call from Busan, a donor. Recently declared, transport in progress.
The surgical team began preparations, the transplant coordinator reviewed protocols, and Ji-won, who hadn't exhaled in days, finally laughed, really laughed, the kind that makes your eyes water and your ribs loosen. She and Min-jun stood in the hallway that night, barefoot in hospital slippers, too stunned to sleep. He looked healthier already, just from hearing the word donor out loud. "You think it's some ajusi with a tattoo who wanted one last good deed?" Min-jun joked, voice still hoarse. "Don't jinx it," Ji-won replied, mock serious. "If you do, I'm taking the spicy pork roll off the menu permanently." They laughed like thieves who had outrun the siren. They stayed up late that night, texting Ha-eun, refreshing hospital updates, staring at each other with disbelief and unsaid gratitude. Song-jin even let himself imagine a spring wedding. The hallway window let in soft moonlight, like the world itself had softened its edges. But at 3:12 a.m., just as the donor cooler was wheeled in, a nurse stepped out of the surgical wing, expression unreadable. The lead hepatologist followed moments later, holding a clipboard he didn't look at. "I'm sorry," he said. The liver hadn't survived the final viability assessment. Too long without perfusion. Ischemia time exceeded. It was now medically unusable. The news spread through the corridor not like a crash, but like a light slowly being dimmed. Ji-won's hands clenched around her phone, not to check updates, just to hold on to something. The transplant fellow who'd brought the rumor whispered again, this time lower. "We were so close. I really thought this one would hold." By morning, Min-jun's bilirubin had spiked. His eyes had yellowed again. His appetite vanished, and the brief flame of hope that had flickered through the ward had gone out without ceremony. Once again, the idea of living donation returned to the center of the conversation, not as desperation, but as the last reliable instrument in the room. No decorations, no distractions, no garnish. Just the truth of it, a choice no longer shared, but circled back to. And somewhere in her chest, Ji-won felt the old weight shift back into her hands, not with panic, but with clarity. She had hoped for a miracle, but she had never depended on one. The surgical calendar had been marked. Ji-won's name sat printed neatly beside Min-jun's, connected by a hyphen, as though what lay between them was simply a line. It wasn't. 2 days before the scheduled operation, one of the transplant coordinators flagged something during a routine pre-op review. The surgical team ordered a final imaging series, more out of protocol than concern. Ji-won was healthy, strong, her earlier tests clean. They expected confirmation. But medicine often finds what it isn't looking for. The scan revealed a vascular anomaly in Ji-won's right liver lobe, a rare configuration of twisted, overlapping vessels, tightly coiled like thread soaked in ink. It had gone undetected during the initial assessments. Now it changed everything. The surgeon called her in with a neutral expression that didn't match the caution in his tone. "It's not a disqualifier," he began gently, "but it increases your risk profile significantly." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. Each sentence carried the weight of probabilities Ji-won hadn't planned for. "Your mortality risk isn't theoretical, Ms. Yoon. It's several times higher now than the baseline." He paused. "And there is also a high likelihood that the operation could impair your fertility." The words dropped like cold water against skin that had just begun to feel warm again. Ji-won sat there, nodding mechanically, her brain struggling to organize the new data into something she could reason with. But the thoughts refused to sort themselves. For the first time since the process began, she was afraid, not of the pain, not even of the death, but of the permanence. The idea that if she went under the knife, she might never wake up to the life she was building. When she left the consultation room, she walked to the end of the corridor and found a chair with a view of nothing. She placed her fingers on the side of her neck, finding her pulse. She counted it, not for any clinical reason, just to know it was still there. Suddenly, those seconds felt like something she wanted to keep, not give away, not yet. Min-jun wasn't told everything, but in hospitals, silence carries further than sound. He overheard just enough from the hallway, the clipped medical terms, the whispered word unusual, the phrase higher risk to the donor than we prefer. That evening, he stopped speaking entirely. Not out of anger, but something worse, guilt he couldn't verbalize. He began refusing food again, asking nurses to dim the lights, pretending to sleep even when his body trembled. When Ji-won entered the room with the thermos and her usual composure, he turned his face to the wall and whispered, "I'm sorry." Nothing more. In the silence that followed, Song-jin stepped in. He closed the door behind him and spoke with the calmness of someone who had been patient for too long. "I love you," he said quietly. "But I won't watch you risk everything for someone because you think you owe it. You don't." His voice was low, but not weak. He wasn't pleading. He was drawing a boundary, with shaking hands perhaps, but with clarity. "If you go through with this because you believe you have to, I can't stand beside that table. I won't be the doctor who helped walk you there." There was no cruelty in it, but the pain was surgical in its precision. That night, the hospital ethics board froze the transplant process. Without warning, Ji-won was called in for a meeting. A formal concern had been filed. Allegations of potential coercion, pressure arising from social media campaigns, and the emotional entanglement between donor and recipient. The complaint didn't name names, but everyone knew where it came from. Ji-won's hands stayed still as they listed the issues. She didn't argue, didn't cry. She simply listened, like someone who had run out of ways to defend choices that no longer belonged to her. When she walked out of the room, Song-jin was waiting. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't pretend not to know. "I filed the report," he said simply. "I asked for the pause. You needed space. You needed time to choose again." His voice held something terrifying in its gentleness. He wasn't ashamed of what he'd done. In fact, he believed it was love. Ji-won's eyes dropped to his hands, steady, clean, capable, surgeon's hands. Hands that could hold arteries and reset bones, but that tonight did nothing, didn't hold hers, didn't stop this. "You were trying to save me," she said flatly. "But you didn't ask if I wanted saving." The silence between them was immediate and irreversible, not sharp, but total, like snow that muffles every sound and changes the shape of all familiar things. Back in her temporary dorm, Ji-won removed the wedding ring Song-jin had given her just a week earlier, not in anger, not even in sorrow, but like someone returning an object that didn't belong to her anymore. On her nightstand sat the discharge papers she had never filled out, and beneath them, the surgical consent form, with her name already printed, not signed, not yet, but still waiting.
It didn't break things. It didn't scream. It didn't ask permission. It simply walked into Ji-won's bones like it had always lived there. She stood in front of the hospital bulletin board on the 4th floor, the one near the family waiting room, cluttered with thank you cards, inspirational quotes, and a laminated flyer with her face and Min-jun's next to the words, "Urgent living donor match needed. Help save a life." The photo was old. They were both laughing. Neither knew how thin the line between loyalty and loss could stretch. She stared at the flyer for a long time, then reached up and tore it down. The tape fought her fingers. The edges ripped unevenly. But she didn't stop until the poster became fragments, and the fragments became paper snow. Then Ji-won sat on the floor. Not collapsed, composed. Around her, the shredded remnants of other people's prayers fluttered like confetti. A nurse passed by, paused, and opened her mouth to speak. But something in Ji-won's posture said, "Not yet. Not this." Min-jun arrived moments later, summoned by a nurse who didn't know what else to do. When he saw her surrounded by what used to be his face on donation flyers, he stopped mid-step. She didn't raise her voice. She barely even moved. "We shared everything," Ji-won said quietly, not looking up. "Beds, secrets, snowstorms, hunger. We've been through winters together and summers that almost killed us." Then her eyes met his. But not this choice. That night, Ji-won left the hospital without telling anyone. Not out of defiance, but to breathe without walls. She went to the Han River, that great artery slicing Seoul in two, where joggers made smooth loops like clock hands, and cyclists dodged lovers arguing in hushed tones. Ji-won sat alone on a bench, jacket zipped high, watching people whose lives weren't held together by surgical tape and donor registries. They moved with casual autonomy, unburdened by consent forms, test results, or ethical review boards. It wasn't envy she felt, it was clarity. She returned to the hospital just after dawn, not exhausted, but reset. Her movements were deliberate now, precise like a surgeon's incision. By noon, she had recorded a video statement and submitted it directly to the ethics board. No trembling, no theatrics. My name is Yoon Ji-won. I am the registered living donor candidate for Kang Min-jun. No one has pressured me. I am not confused. I am not coerced. This decision is mine, and I will not apologize for it. The board wouldn't be able to dismiss a first-hand statement, and even if they did, she would no longer let bureaucracy speak louder than her will. In the hospital cafeteria, Ji-won found Song-jin seated at a back corner table, reviewing a case file he didn't seem to be reading. He looked up as she approached, his eyes betraying a day of no sleep and too much waiting. She sat across from him without ceremony. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Ji-won pulled off the simple silver ring he had once placed in her palm. "I love you," she said, and meant it. She placed the ring on the table gently, not angrily, but like someone returning a key that no longer opened the right door. But if love asks me to stand still while someone I care about dies, then love is asking too much from the wrong person. There was no drama in her tone, no bitterness, just truth, and the kind of peace that only comes after everything else has been set on fire. Elsewhere in the hospital, Min-jun sat in front of a computer terminal, staring at the online donor registry interface. The screen blinked with the open form he had nearly submitted that morning. Request to withdraw from living donor consideration. The mouse hovered over the final field. He had written the reason. He had filled in the date. He had hovered over confirm. But he hadn't clicked it. The cursor blinked now like a metronome, measuring his fear, his guilt, his cowardice. Finally, with a breath that felt like punishment, he deleted the entire request. And in its place, he typed, "I accept the living donor pathway. The donor is aware and has given full consent. Proceed." He didn't press send just yet. First, he walked to Ji-won's room. She was packing away papers. She turned before he knocked, as if she'd been waiting. Their eyes met. For a moment, Min-jun tried to be strong enough to stop her. "We can still call the whole thing off," he said. It was a lie he wanted to believe. But Ji-won simply smiled. A quiet, irreversible smile. The kind that knows exactly which bridge has to burn for the boat to pass. She reached into her bag and pulled out a carefully wrapped rice ball from their cart. Tuna and pickled radish, his favorite. He took it, not because he had an appetite, but because sometimes love looks like letting someone give you the last thing they can. The operating room was cold with readiness. At 6:03 a.m., the surgical team stood like a symphony in white and steel, every movement calibrated by muscle memory and months of training. Instruments gleamed under sterile lights, drapes were secured. The hum of machines whispered like breath. This was the choreography of survival. Artery, vein, bile duct, each line carefully mapped, each movement prepared to answer catastrophe before it occurred. For a time, everything looked clean. Ji-won's right lobe was mobilized, the incision precise. The anomaly, that tangled forest of vessels, was in view. The lead surgeon, steady-handed, moved cautiously. Every vessel clipped, cauterized, irrigated. The team worked like clockwork. Then came the first bleed. It wasn't dramatic, more a seep than a stream. A problem, not a threat. They controlled it. The second came from deeper tissue, Unexpected, sharp. It took more clamps, more time, still manageable. The third arrived like a refusal, not just to be solved, but to be understood. It came from nowhere the scan had marked, from a vessel that shouldn't have existed, a rupture beneath the rupture, a place too deep, too fast, too much. Suddenly, minutes stopped behaving like minutes. Pressure dropped. Gauze disappeared faster than hands could find it. Voices rose, but not in panic, in controlled urgency. The kind that only arrives when a team knows the margin is gone. In the adjacent theater, Min-jun's transplant was proceeding. His new liver, her liver, took. Warmed under perfusate, it pinked like a promise. Monitors beeped their polite rhythm. His body, broken by weeks of collapse, began to hold again. He awoke hours later in Recovery Room B, blinking into soft light, his mouth dry. A nurse with kind eyes leaned over, her voice wrapped in clinical softness. "The surgery was successful," she said. "You'll be monitored closely. Everything's going well." But her eyes, they held something she didn't say. In a hallway not far from there, Park Song-jin sat on a bench, still in his scrubs, arms folded as if bracing for something that had already happened. He had stared at the same wall clock for so long that the numbers had detached from meaning. 1408, 1432, 1501. He didn't know when the surgery had ended, only that it had ended. No one had come to explain. They didn't need to. He had worked enough ORs to understand what silence meant. "They tried," a voice finally said. But Song-jin didn't look up. He had spent his entire career saving knees, shoulders, wrists, limbs that broke but could be repaired. But nothing had taught him what to do with a love that had walked into the fire on purpose. They buried Ji-won 3 days later, under a soft, white sky that refused to choose between sun or snow. The mourners arrived early, wrapped in black coats and quiet disbelief. Some were doctors, some were customers, some just knew the taste of her food and the sound of her laughter in alleyways at midnight. The stall was closed, but Ha-eun stood beside it holding umbrellas for anyone who didn't bring one. On the side of the cart, she taped a laminated photo. Ji-won, ponytail tight, gloves powdered, laughing at something no one could remember. Probably a misrolled egg sheet or a joke about seaweed. They didn't play music at the funeral. The wind did enough. Min-jun returned to the stall 91 days later, scarred in more ways than the one under his gown. He no longer laughed as easily. His hand trembled when he rolled the first kimbap. He burned the rice once, dropped a tray of radish slices. But he kept going. He renamed the stall Half Moon. It was a quiet joke. Ji-won used to say no rice roll should ever be a full circle. Life tastes better when something's missing. In the months that followed, Min-jun launched a living donor safety fund in her name. It wasn't much at first. A website, a list of resources, an emergency stipend program. But it grew. Hospitals reached out. Donors wrote letters. Min-jun visited the Han River every Sunday morning and sat in the same place Ji-won once had. He spoke into the wind, not loudly, not always in words. "Some debts shouldn't be paid in full," he told the river once. "Some loves ask for receipts the heart can't issue." At the fund's inaugural symposium, Park Song-jin took the stage in a quiet lecture hall. His presentation was clinical: improved vascular screening, preoperative anomaly detection, revised ethics procedures. But his voice didn't shake. "We need language," he said, "that doesn't turn love into a demand." Afterward, in the hallway, he and Min-jun stood beside the windows as winter light pushed gently through the glass. They didn't speak. There was no apology, no absolution. But the silence was something more than grief. Something that lived between not forgiveness and not blame.
Back at the stall, above the counter, there hung a photo of Ji-won and Min-jun, both in aprons, bickering over a jar of sesame seeds. Below it, taped beside the menu board, was a line handwritten in her neat Hangul. "If I have any time left, share it." And that became their ritual. They fed night workers and taxi drivers and students with eyes too tired for their age. They served the lonely, the lost, the regulars who came just to feel remembered. And when someone, usually in the quiet of 2 a.m., asked why the kimbap tasted like a story, Min-jun would answer carefully. "We shared everything, and when love asked for too much, she gave the only thing I couldn't." The rice held, the seaweed didn't tear. And somewhere, beneath the soft hiss of the grill and the buzz of neon signs, the ledger finally closed.